Abraham is dependent and immature when the story starts. He lives with his wealthy parents, and he's never had to lift a finger, even though he's like into his 7th decade. And then a voice comes to him. And you could think about it as the voice of calling, or the voice of adventure, or the voice of conscience. They all work equally well. And it says to him, you have to leave your zone of comfort. You have to leave what you are accustomed to and what served you. And you have to journey out into the world and have the terrible adventure of your life. And if you do that, I will make you a covenant. This is the Abrahamic covenant. And I took it apart in We Who Wrestle with God, and I've been lecturing about it, thinking it through, because I think there's something unbelievably profound in it. So God comes to Abraham as the voice that tells him to step out of his zone of comfort and to move forward radically. Okay, so that's a definition of the divine, by the way, in that story, right? It's not a call to belief. It's a definition of the highest calling. Okay, so here's the deal. God tells Abraham, if you do this, so let's say you follow the pathway of developmental impetus, you'll become a blessing to yourself. So that's a good deal. And that would imply that the instinct that moves us out into the world, followed properly, is the best guarantee of our future security and opportunity, which has to be the case. Those things have to line up. Okay, so that's offer one. Offer two is your name will become renowned among those who know you for valid reasons. So you'll establish a reputation that's genuine and deep. Number three, all your enemies will flee before you, and nothing will be able to withstand your movement forward. Number four, you'll establish something of lasting permanence. In Abraham's case, he establishes what I think is the pattern of paternal prowess that radically guarantees the multi-generational survival of his offspring. And he's guaranteed to be the father of nations. And the final kicker, and this is brilliant, you'll do it in a way that brings nothing but abundance to everyone else. So imagine that this would imply that the impulse that moves us past that zone of convenience that people will tyrannically cling to, that the manifestation of that spirit is the same process that brings peace and opportunity to life, that guarantees reputation, that makes you implacable and unopposable in the medium to long run, that allows you to establish something multi-generationally permanent, including a biological legacy, and that brings abundance to everyone else. So that speaks of an alignment with the instinct to move forward. That would be the instinct that's counter to tyranny, that tyranny we described earlier. That aligns all that with the pattern that would radically increase the survival of your progeny if that pattern is duplicated as it cascades down the generations.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a ready answer regarding the specific biblical story, but I can certainly incorporate an evolutionary angle to these temporal decisions, these intertemporal delaying gratification. So let me tell you about two great studies. These are not my studies, but they're quite evolutionary in spirit. So usually when you study intertemporal decisions, you make people go through a bunch of tasks where you set up the tension between, I can give you $100 now, or you can wait 7 days and I'll give you $130. And then depending on the pattern of responses that you and I give, I can calculate your lambda parameter, which basically captures how much of a delayed or immediate gratifier you are. Okay, fair enough. Now, most psychologists and certainly economists have presumed that that lambda parameter is an invariable part of your personality. So Jordan Peterson might be an immediate gratifier, Gad Saad might be a delayed gratifier, and that becomes invariant. Well, it turns out that the story is a bit more complex in an evolutionarily relevant way. So for example, if you make people drink a sugary drink or a placebo, I can get you to alter your lambda parameter. So people who are satiated, physically satiated because they had a sugary drink, are more likely to delay their immediate rewards because they are literally satiated.
That makes perfect sense. Sure.
Now, and listen to this one. So that's related to survival, right? Because I'm drinking something which is a consumatory thing. Now let's prime the mating module. If I show men and women photos of sexy opposite sex targets, that priming doesn't work for women for obvious evolutionary reasons. But for men, if you prime them with photos of scantily clad sexy women, their lambda parameter changes such that they want it now. So in other words, they become a lot more driven by immediate gratification, even if it's in a different domain.
That generalizes. Oh, that's interesting.
Exactly. So so I'm either catering to your mating module or to your survival module. And because these are evolutionarily relevant triggers, I can alter what most scientists thought was an invariant lambda parameter. And so to your point, your intuition of asking an evolutionist about intertemporal choices, there really is an evolutionary story to that.
Well, that's also reflected in the Abrahamic story, because Abraham's relationship to this voice that calls him forward is sacrificial. He has to give up something in the present that's valuable. That's why this took me a long time to figure out, Gad. I didn't know to begin with that the reason that the deepest relationship in these ancient stories is catalyzed by sacrifice was because people were trying to work through this paradoxical idea that if you give up something in the present of value, and you do that properly, whatever that means, because that becomes a mystery, then you can stabilize the medium and long term and also the community. And so you think about what this means, if this is right. And like it's evident to me from comparing multiple stories that sacrifice is the ritual of delay of gratification, right? It's the ritual of work, right? And work is a sacrifice because you give up your pursuit of immediate gratification in the present to stabilize your future and to fill it with opportunity. And so, sophisticated communities are dependent on sophisticated sacrifice. And then the question becomes sacrifice in service of what? In the Abraham story, it's in the service of the instinct that moves you adventurously forward, which is a lovely way of conceptualizing it. But the fact that the sacrifice is involved. So what happens too is that Abraham pursues a sequence of expanding adventures, each of which demands a more exacting sacrifice. And that culminates in God's request that he'd sacrifice his son, right? You could say to the spirit of adventure. Of course, Abraham gets to keep his son, which is the moral of the story, I think, which is that if you're willing to sacrifice even your children to what's highest, then you'll get them back, right? And you'll win. But it's a long-term game. We did experiments with that lambda technology. And we showed that, and this is, I think, very much in keeping with what you described, if you put people in a state of enhanced positive emotion, they're more likely to discount the future because that's the activation of that appetitive system. And it's also the case that extroverts will discount the future more heavily than introverts. And extroverts are in a state of enhanced positive emotion. And so, right, an extrovert is pursuing opportunity in the social realm pretty much all the time. And so...
Well, and the capacity to delay gratification turns out to have unbelievable beneficial downstream effects, whether it be to your likelihood of success in life, whether it be to your health, whether it be to your happiness. So let's just take a few examples. You and I sacrificed going out and partying when we were young, when many of our friends did so. We probably stayed in school. I don't know when you finished your PhD. I finished my PhD in my late 20s, when many of my friends would have already been earning paychecks for 5, 6, 8 years. But by sacrificing that, when you look at us when we're both 60, probably one would argue that I've made up for whatever I sacrificed back then, and as you have. The marshmallow test, which of course you're very familiar with, there's research that shows that the children who were able to, pass the marshmallow test, to really not take that extra marshmallow when the experimenter was looking, if we track those children who had that delayed gratification reflex later in life, they were more successful. So it applies to everything. Think about weight gain, right? When I stop myself from having the immediate dopamine hit of that extra piece of chocolate cake, I am sacrificing the immediate pleasure today for making sure that in 10 years, I'm not much overweight, which, by the way, I greatly failed at many years ago when I ended up being 256 pounds, but not having the height of a football linebacker. And so many of our downstream either successes or failures stem from the original thing that we're talking about, which is, are you able to sacrifice something today for something positive